Sometimes, history doesn't begin with a gunshot. It doesn't begin with a war. It doesn't even begin with a song. Sometimes, history begins with a rumor. A single sentence, repeated so many times, that eventually the entire world accepts it as the truth. The year was 1960. America had never been more divided over music. Not politics, not sports, not movies. Music. Every morning before the sun climbed above the skyline, printing presses thundered through the darkness. Massive rolls of paper disappeared beneath giant steel machines. Fresh ink filled the air. Within minutes, thousands of newspapers spilled onto delivery trucks. Before breakfast, the headlines had already reached millions of homes. Everywhere, the same two faces appeared. Frank Sinatra, Elvis Presley. One headline boldly asked, "Can the old king stop the new one?" Another newspaper chose different words. "Is Elvis about to replace Frank Sinatra?" A radio announcer laughed. "If those two ever stand on the same stage." He paused dramatically. "Someone's crown is going to fall." Listeners smiled. Drivers turned up the volume. Coffee shops filled with debate. Nobody questioned the story anymore. People only argued about the ending. Because America loves a rivalry. Always has. Always will. A rivalry creates heroes, villains, victories, defeats. It gives people someone to cheer for, and someone to cheer against. The newspapers understood that. The radio stations understood that. Television producers certainly understood that. And before Frank Sinatra or Elvis Presley had spoken a single word to each other, the entire country believed they were enemies. But history rarely follows the script written by headlines. Because the most important stories usually begin where cameras are not allowed. Long before Elvis Presley became the biggest name in American entertainment, Frank Sinatra had already become something much larger than a singer. He was elegance, confidence, control. His records drifted through expensive restaurants where crystal glasses reflected candlelight. His voice echoed inside grand hotels filled with businessmen discussing fortunes over dinner. His music played during weddings, anniversaries, military celebrations, and quiet evenings when husbands gently asked their wives to dance one more time before the night ended. People didn't simply buy Frank Sinatra records. They built memories around them. His songs became part of people's lives. When young singers dreamed about success, they imagined becoming the next Frank Sinatra. When nightclub owners wanted to advertise sophistication, his name appeared on the posters. When television producers wanted guaranteed audiences, they called Frank. Because Frank Sinatra represented certainty, reliability, professionalism. He didn't chase greatness anymore. Greatness had already found him. Every performance looked effortless. Every movement seemed perfectly timed. He didn't need dramatic choreography. He didn't need controversy. He walked onto the stage, adjusted the microphone, smiled, and somehow, an entire audience stopped breathing for just a second. That kind of respect cannot be purchased. It cannot be manufactured. It can only be earned. Night after night, year after year, performance after performance, failure after failure. Frank Sinatra understood that better than almost anyone alive. He knew what sacrifice looked like. He knew loneliness. He knew rejection. The public usually sees the applause, rarely the years required to earn it. By the end of the 1950s, many Americans believed they were witnessing the greatest popular singer of their generation. Some believed no one would ever come close. History smiled quietly, because somewhere far away, another story had already begun. Memphis wasn't trying to create a revolution. Neither was the shy young man carrying a guitar through its streets. Elvis Presley wasn't born into luxury. He didn't grow up surrounded by powerful people. He didn't attend glamorous parties. He wasn't raised believing success was guaranteed. He understood ordinary life. He understood uncertainty. He understood what it meant to dream about something that felt impossible. Long before crowds screamed his name. Long before photographers chased him through airports. Long before the bright lights. There was simply a young man who loved music. Not because it promised fame, because it made him feel alive. He listened carefully. He absorbed everything around him. Gospel inside church walls. Country songs drifting from radios. Rhythm and blues performed with extraordinary emotion. Instead of choosing one style, he carried pieces of all of them. Without realizing it, he was creating something entirely new. Something no record executive could fully explain. The first people who heard him often struggled to describe what made him different. It wasn't only the voice. Many singers possessed beautiful voices. It wasn't only the appearance. Many performers looked handsome. It was something much more difficult to define. Presence. The feeling that whenever Elvis entered a room, something unexpected might happen. Audiences sensed it immediately. They leaned forward before he even reached the microphone. Not because they knew exactly what he would do. Because they knew they had never seen anyone quite like him before. That feeling cannot be rehearsed. It either exists or it doesn't. Elvis had it from the very beginning. As his popularity grew, America changed with him. Teenagers who had once dressed like their parents suddenly wanted something different. Record stores filled with young faces searching for Elvis albums. Barbers received unusual requests. I want my hair like Elvis. Clothing stores noticed changing tastes. Music felt younger, faster, less predictable. Parents watched with confusion. Some smiled. Others worried. Many simply asked, "What is happening to this country?" Because change rarely announces itself politely. It arrives quietly. Then suddenly, it seems to be everywhere. Television cameras followed Elvis wherever possible. Photographers waited outside hotels. Concert promoters struggled to organize crowds that became larger every month. Police officers found themselves controlling excitement instead of traffic. Girls cried. Some fainted. Others traveled extraordinary distances, hopping to catch only a brief glimpse of him stepping out of a car. Journalists had seen famous entertainers before. They struggled to find words for this. Popularity didn't seem large enough. Superstar didn't seem accurate enough. This felt closer to a movement, a cultural wave that refused to slow down. And every wave eventually crashes against something older, something established, something powerful. Without realizing it, the country had begun comparing Elvis Presley with the one man everyone believed represented American music itself, Frank Sinatra. Not because the two men had chosen that comparison, because America had. And once America chooses a story, it becomes almost impossible to stop. The strange thing about history is that it doesn't always begin with facts. Sometimes, it begins with a story that people desperately want to believe. And once that story spreads, it grows a life of its own. That was exactly what was happening across America. Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley had become more than two famous singers. They had become symbols. One represented tradition. The other represented change. One reminded America of where it had been. The other forced America to confront where it was going. The newspapers understood the power of that contrast better than anyone. Every editor knew a simple truth. Respect rarely sells newspapers. Conflict does. And so, day after day, the headlines became louder, more dramatic, more personal. The old king faces his greatest challenge. Can Elvis take Sinatra's throne? Who really owns American music? People bought the papers, read every word, argued with friends, then returned the next morning to buy another edition. The rivalry had become irresistible. Not because Frank Sinatra was attacking Elvis Presley every day. Not because Elvis Presley was trying to overthrow Frank Sinatra. But because millions of people loved the idea that history could only have one king. Imagine America at that moment. Drive through New York. A taxi driver has Sinatra playing through the radio. Ask him who the greatest singer alive is. He won't hesitate. Frank Sinatra. Now travel hundreds of miles south. Walk into a crowded diner filled with teenagers. Elvis is playing through the jukebox. The entire room begins singing before the chorus even starts. Ask the same question. You'll hear a completely different answer. Elvis Presley. Neither group believed they were wrong. Because music had stopped being entertainment. It had become identity. People weren't defending songs anymore. They were defending themselves. Their generation. Their memories. Their future. Without realizing it, America had quietly divided into two worlds. Frank Sinatra watched the country changing. He had spent years mastering an industry built on elegance. His performances were carefully crafted. Every note mattered. Every lyric carried emotion. He respected discipline, preparation, control. Those qualities had carried him to the top. Then rock and roll arrived. Louder, faster, less predictable. Sinatra publicly criticized the genre in earlier interviews, believing it lacked the musical depth and craftsmanship he valued. Those comments were widely reported, and many journalists framed them as a rejection of the movement Elvis had come to symbolize. That was all the press needed. The headlines practically wrote themselves. Readers weren't interested in nuance. They wanted a showdown. Yet behind those headlines, the reality was more complicated. Professional artists often disagree about styles of music. That doesn't automatically make them enemies. But newspapers don't sell complexity. They sell certainty. Meanwhile, Elvis Presley wasn't waking up each morning thinking about defeating Frank Sinatra. His schedule barely allowed him to think about anything except surviving another day of extraordinary fame. Every airport became an event. Every hotel attracted crowds. Every concert demanded enormous amounts of energy. Every public appearance required security. Sometimes he couldn't leave a building without hundreds of people waiting outside. Fame looked glamorous from a distance. Up close, it could feel exhausting. There were moments when Elvis couldn't simply walk down a street like everyone else. He couldn't quietly enjoy dinner. He couldn't disappear into a crowd. Millions recognized his face. Millions believed they knew him. Very few actually did. The louder the applause became, the smaller his private world sometimes felt. Frank Sinatra understood that feeling better than most people realized. He had experienced his own overwhelming fame years earlier. Different generations, different audiences, the same invisible weight. Still, the public never saw that side. They saw magazine covers, concert photographs, television appearances, perfect smiles, standing ovations. They didn't see the pressure, the endless travel, the loneliness that sometimes follows extraordinary success, or the responsibility that comes with becoming the voice of an entire generation. Because once the world begins calling you a legend, it quietly stops allowing you to be human. Every decision becomes news. Every sentence becomes a headline. Every opinion becomes controversy. Frank lived with it. Elvis lived with it. Neither could escape it. Then, one announcement changed everything. Frank Sinatra would host a television special. And among the guests would be Elvis Presley. The moment that news reached the public, America exploded with speculation. Reporters rushed to publish new articles. Radio hosts filled entire programs discussing what might happen. Columnists predicted awkward conversations. Some imagined cold smiles. Others predicted open hostility. A few even wondered if one performer would refuse to appear. The anticipation grew larger every single day. Restaurants advertised that the show would be playing on every television. Bars promised special viewing parties. Families adjusted dinner plans. Neighbors invited one another over. It wasn't being treated like a musical performance. It felt like a heavyweight championship. Except there would be no boxing gloves. No referee. Only two men, carrying the expectations of an entire nation. Inside the television studio, workers had already begun preparing. Massive cameras rolled into position. Miles of cable stretched across the floor. Microphones were tested. The orchestra rehearsed the same passages over and over again. Directors checked every angle. Lighting technicians adjusted every spotlight. To everyone working behind the scenes, it was another production. A very important one. But still, a production. Outside those walls, America imagined something completely different. It imagined history waiting to explode. What nobody outside that building could possibly know was that the most unforgettable moment of the entire day would happen before the audience heard a single note, before the applause, before the music, before the cameras began recording. Because behind one quiet hallway, two men were slowly walking toward the same door. And in just a few moments, the story the newspapers had spent months creating was about to meet reality. The closer the broadcast came, the quieter the studio became. It was strange. Only hours earlier, the building had been filled with conversations. Stagehands called out instructions. Musicians joked with one another. Producers hurried from room to room, carrying stacks of notes. Now, almost everyone spoke in whispers. No one wanted to admit it, but they all felt the same thing. History was walking through the front door. Outside the studio, the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Crowds had gathered behind metal barricades long before either star arrived. Reporters adjusted their cameras. Photographers stood on top of ladders. Every arriving black car caused a wave of excitement. Is that Sinatra? No, that's one of the producers. What about that one? The questions never stopped. Across America, radio announcers reminded listeners about the special broadcast later that evening. Newspapers had already printed extra editions. Commentators repeated the same prediction. Tonight, the old king finally meets the new king. It sounded perfect. It sounded dramatic. And above all, it sold newspapers. Inside the studio, however, nobody was talking about kings. They were talking about microphones, lighting, camera angles, song arrangements, because the people working behind the scenes understood something the public often forgot. No matter how famous an artist becomes, a performance is still a performance. It still demands preparation, discipline, precision. Then, one of the security guards quietly spoke into his radio. "Mr. Sinatra has arrived." The hallway instantly grew still. Several crew members looked toward the entrance. Frank Sinatra stepped out of the car, wearing a perfectly tailored suit. He smiled politely, shook hands with a few familiar faces, thanked a technician who held the door open, then disappeared into his dressing room. Professional, calm, exactly as everyone expected. Only a short time later, another message echoed through the hallway. "Elvis is here." The reaction outside was immediate. The crowd erupted. Fans screamed his name. Camera flashes exploded one after another. Security carefully guided Elvis through the entrance as photographers fought for one more picture. Inside, everything became quiet once again. The two biggest names in American music were now inside the same building, separated by only a few walls. Yet they hadn't seen each other. Not yet. The producers checked their watches. The orchestra rehearsed one final time. The director reviewed the opening sequence. Every minute brought them closer to the moment the entire country had been waiting for. No one knew exactly what would happen. Would there be awkward silence? A polite greeting? A cold handshake? Or would months of speculation prove completely wrong? Only one closed hallway separated rumor from reality. Only one door separated two generations of music. And somewhere beyond that door, two men, each carrying the expectations of millions, were about to meet for the very first time. Neither of them could stop what was coming. Neither of them could imagine how that single meeting would reshape the story America had been telling itself for months. Because sometimes, history doesn't change beneath bright stage lights. Sometimes, it changes in the silence before the curtain rises. And behind that closed door, the first chapter of an unforgettable story was about to begin. For a brief moment, the hallway was completely silent. Not the ordinary silence of an empty building. The kind of silence that only exists when everyone is waiting for something impossible to predict. Stagehands stopped pushing equipment. A lighting technician lowered his clipboard. Even the musicians inside the studio seemed to play more quietly, as if they sensed that something important was about to happen. At the far end of the corridor, Frank Sinatra stepped out of his dressing room. His jacket sat perfectly across his shoulders. Every movement was calm, every step deliberate. He had walked toward thousands of stages throughout his career. He had performed before presidents, celebrities, and audiences around the world. Very little could surprise him anymore. Yet today felt different. Not because he feared the man waiting somewhere in the building, but because he understood something the newspapers never could. Music was changing, and every generation eventually watches a new generation arrive. At the opposite end of the hallway, Elvis Presley adjusted the cuffs of his jacket. He smiled politely at a production assistant who wished him good luck. Despite becoming one of the most recognizable faces in America, there was no trace of arrogance, only quiet focus. He knew millions of people would be watching later that evening. He knew every movement would be analyzed. Every smile, every word, every note. Fame had taught him that even the smallest moment could become tomorrow's headline. A producer looked down the hallway, then spoke softly. "Gentlemen, we're ready." Neither man hurried. Neither tried to make an entrance. They simply walked, one step at a time, toward the same destination. Crew members instinctively moved aside. Some smiled nervously. Others pretended to stay busy while secretly watching from the corners of the room. For months, the newspapers had imagined this meeting. Radio hosts had argued about it. Fans had chosen sides because of it. Now, it was finally happening. Frank Sinatra looked up. So did Elvis Presley. Their eyes met for the first time. No cameras. No audience. No applause. Just two artists standing a few feet apart. For one quiet heartbeat, the hallway seemed frozen. Then Elvis took the first step forward. A respectful smile crossed his face. "Mr. Sinatra." He extended his hand. Frank looked at the young performer who had captured the imagination of an entire generation. Then, he smiled, reached forward, and shook his hand. That single handshake lasted only a moment. But in that moment, months of speculation suddenly felt very small. There was no hostility, no dramatic confrontation, no battle for a throne, only mutual professionalism, only respect. The crew exchanged quiet glances. Some almost looked disappointed, not because they wanted conflict, but because conflict was what everyone had been expecting. Reality had chosen a different path. As rehearsals began, the atmosphere slowly changed. The orchestra played softly in the background. Technicians adjusted microphones. Directors discussed camera positions. Between rehearsals, Frank and Elvis spoke briefly. Not about headlines. Not about rivalries. They spoke about performing live. About the pressure of stepping onto a stage where millions expected perfection. About how quickly an audience could sense confidence or fear. They came from different musical worlds, but success had taught them many of the same lessons. Both understood the loneliness that sometimes follows extraordinary fame. Both understood the responsibility of carrying expectations far larger than themselves. Outside, none of this was visible. The crowd still believed a showdown was coming. Reporters continued preparing dramatic headlines. Radio commentators debated who would dominate the broadcast. America remained convinced it was about to witness a clash between two kings. Inside the studio, the story unfolding was much quieter. And perhaps far more meaningful. A stage manager suddenly called out, "5 minutes." The room transformed. Musicians took their seats. Spotlights warmed to life. Cameras rolled silently into position. Audience members settled into their chairs. A production assistant counted down the final minutes. Frank adjusted his tie. Elvis took one slow breath. Neither looked nervous, but both understood the weight of what was about to happen. Beyond the studio walls, millions of television sets were already glowing across America. Families gathered in living rooms. Restaurants turned up the volume. Bars felt unusually quiet. The nation waited for a rivalry. Instead, It was about to witness something far more powerful. Because sometimes, the greatest statement a legend can make isn't through competition. It's through respect. The director raised his hand. A red light flickered to life above the nearest camera. Stand by. 3, 2, 1. And at that exact moment, the entire country held its breath. The red light above the camera glowed. Silence. For one brief second, it felt as though the entire nation had stopped breathing. Then, the opening music filled the studio. The orchestra came alive. The audience erupted into applause. Frank Sinatra stepped into the spotlight exactly as millions expected him to. Relaxed, confident, perfectly composed, he smiled toward the audience, thanking them with a simple nod before the applause slowly faded. There was no sign of nervousness. If he felt pressure, years of experience refused to let it show. Across America, families leaned closer to their television sets. Living rooms became strangely quiet. Even children who barely understood why this night mattered sensed that something important was unfolding. Newspaper editors watched from their offices. Radio commentators took notes. Entertainment reporters prepared tomorrow morning's headlines before the show had even reached its halfway point. Everyone was waiting for one moment. The moment Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley would finally stand together. The orchestra played the final notes of Sinatra's introduction. Then, the announcer's voice echoed through the studio. Ladies and gentlemen, Elvis Presley. A wave of applause swept across the room. Not ordinary applause. It rolled through the audience like thunder. People stood. Some clapped above their heads. Others simply smiled, amazed that they were witnessing two of the biggest names in American entertainment sharing the same stage. Elvis walked forward with calm, measured steps. He wasn't trying to steal the spotlight. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He simply acknowledged the audience with a warm smile before turning toward Frank Sinatra. For a brief moment, they looked at one another again. This time, not behind a closed door, not hidden from the world, but beneath the brightest lights in America. The audience noticed it immediately. There was no tension, no forced politeness, no icy expression, only the quiet confidence of two men who understood exactly how difficult it was to stand where they stood. Frank smiled first. Elvis smiled back. The room relaxed almost instantly. Months of speculation began disappearing in a matter of seconds. The newspapers had promised a rivalry. The audience was witnessing professionalism. As the music began again, something remarkable happened. The contrast people had argued about for months suddenly became something entirely different. Frank's smooth, timeless style filled the room with effortless elegance. Elvis answered with the energy and freshness that had captured a younger generation. Instead of competing, the two styles complemented one another. The audience wasn't watching one era defeat another. They were watching two eras exist together. Some people in the crowd looked surprised. Others looked relieved. The applause grew louder after every exchange. Backstage, producers exchanged satisfied smiles. The tension they had quietly prepared for never arrived. Instead, they were witnessing something much more difficult to create. Mutual respect. Outside the studio, reporters waiting for dramatic stories began receiving updates from colleagues inside. The atmosphere isn't hostile. They're smiling. They're enjoying themselves. Some journalists looked disappointed. Conflict was easier to write about. Respect required a different story. Inside the studio, neither Frank nor Elvis seemed interested in proving who deserved a crown. They were focused on the music, on the audience, on delivering a performance worthy of the occasion. Perhaps that was the lesson no headline could ever fully explain. Legends don't become legends by tearing each other down. They become legends by mastering their craft. As the final notes echoed through the studio, the audience rose to its feet once again. The applause lasted longer than anyone expected. Some people cheered for Frank. Others shouted Elvis's name. Most applauded both. For one unforgettable evening, the question America had been asking for months no longer seemed important. Who was the king? Perhaps that had never been the right question, because history wasn't choosing between Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley. History was making room for both. But outside the studio, tomorrow's newspapers were already being printed. And not every headline would tell the story the audience had actually witnessed. By sunrise, the show was over. The lights inside the studio had gone dark. The orchestra had packed away their instruments. Crew members slowly rolled the television cameras back into storage. The audience had gone home. Frank Sinatra had left through one exit. Elvis Presley through another. The building that had held so much anticipation only hours before was quiet once again. But outside those walls, America was just beginning the conversation. Before most people had even finished breakfast, fresh newspapers landed on front porches across the country. Some headlines celebrated the television special. Others immediately returned to the rivalry. Sinatra and Elvis share the stage. The two kings finally meet. A few newspapers still search for conflict, because conflict attracted attention. Conflict sold copies. It always had. But those who had actually stood inside the studio remembered something very different. Not a battle, not an argument, not a struggle for a throne. They remembered a handshake, a smile, a quiet conversation between two men who understood something the rest of the country was still learning. In the days that followed, the performance became one of the most talked about moments in American entertainment. Television viewers replayed it in their minds. Families discussed it around dinner tables. Radio hosts debated what it meant. Some admitted they had expected fireworks. Instead, they had witnessed professionalism. They had witnessed two artists refusing to become the enemies the public wanted them to be. And perhaps that was far more remarkable, because it is easy to create conflict. It is much harder to choose respect when the entire world expects confrontation. Frank Sinatra continued building a career that would influence generations of singers. His voice remained unmistakable. His presence remained timeless. His music continued filling concert halls, radio stations, and homes around the world. Years passed. Styles changed. Audiences changed. But Frank Sinatra's place in music history never disappeared. It had already been earned. Elvis Presley continued changing popular culture in ways few could have imagined. His concerts grew even larger. His influence reached far beyond music. He inspired countless performers who would follow. For millions of young people, he wasn't simply a singer. He represented possibility. The belief that someone from an ordinary background could change the world through extraordinary talent. Looking back today, it is easy to understand why the media loved the story of two kings competing for one crown. It was dramatic, simple, easy to sell. But history is rarely that simple. Greatness is not measured by how many rivals you defeat. It is measured by the legacy you leave behind. Frank Sinatra never stopped being Frank Sinatra. Elvis Presley never stopped being Elvis Presley. Neither erased the other. Neither needed to. One became the unforgettable voice of an era. The other became the unmistakable symbol of a new one. Together, they prove something that headlines often forget. Music is not a throne with room for only one king. It is a stage, large enough for different voices, different generations, and different legends. Perhaps that is why people still remember that meeting decades later. Not because someone won, not because someone lost, but because, for one unforgettable night, the story the world expected wasn't the story that happened. And sometimes, those are the stories that endure the longest. Because while newspapers eventually fade, respect never goes out of style.